All right, so let's get started. Thank you all for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all, wherever you've joined us from across the world. And thank you for choosing to spend the next couple of hours with us for our event as part of this year's New York Climate Week, albeit a little bit different from years previous. Our event today is the long and the short of it, interlinkages between NDCs and mid-century decarbonisation strategies. It's great to see some very familiar faces in the attendees. And for those of you who I do not know, I'm Fran Fuller from Climate Analytics, our Deputy Director in our New York office and an implementation specialist. We are an international nonprofit that focuses on climate science and policy advice. We're motivated by the desire to empower and support the most vulnerable and continuously trying to align our work towards the long-term temperature goal of the Paris Agreement 1.5. As you all know, 2020 is a very important year in the climate change field, where under the Paris Agreement, countries are expected to submit their revised or updated nationally determined contributions or climate plans, and also develop their long-term strategies. These two processes are fundamentally intertwined in a variety of ways and are also happening against a backdrop of yet another damning report on climate change, the United in Science 2020 report, an extremely active hurricane and cyclone season, and of course, the impacts of the COVID-19 global pandemic. You know, as we ask the most vulnerable countries among us to ever enhance their climate ambition and to strategize in parallel about their long-term low emission development, it's essential for us to reflect on the challenges that they face, opportunities that may be presented, and to work on the ecosystem of support that is required to achieve these goals and prevent rolling back the many development gains that have been made over the past decade and more. You know, as noted by the UN Secretary General recently, never before has it been so clear that we need long-term, inclusive, clean transitions to tackle the climate crisis and achieve sustainable development. So today we're going to explore the synergies between long-term strategies, NDC development, implementation planning, as well as exploring the role of climate finance in the implementation of long-term strategies. Today we have designed our session in three main components. While she will not be joining us live today, we'll first hear a message from the UN Under-Secretary General and High Representative for Least Developed Countries, Landlocked Developing Countries, and Small Island Developing States. Following from the message from the USG, our own Dr. Jansen will provide a presentation on the interlinkages between NDCs and long-term strategies. We'll then move into our panel discussion that will look at enabling short-term victories that catalyze long-term decarbonization. Here we have Ms. Uname Gordon from the Climate Change Division of Jamaica, Kelly Levin from the World Resources Institute, Naranda Maurice George from the Green Climate Fund, and Amanda McKee from the NDC Partnership. So before we kick off, a couple of housekeeping points to help you engage with us and for us to try and have as much of an interactive session as possible. We encourage you to use the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen, and you can add all questions for panelists and the presenter in that Q&A session. That way we can see your questions coming up and ensure that either they're addressed in writing or addressed live by one of our speakers. Any of the comments you can please add in the chat box or engage with each other as you wish. You may also have heard potentially at the beginning of the event, but if not, just so that it's announced again, this event is being recorded and will be subsequently posted on our Climate Analytics website. So thank you again for joining us. And without further delay, we're going to play a video message from the UN Under-Secretary General and High Representative for Least Developed Countries, Landlocked Developing Countries, and Small Island Developing States. Excuse me.
Analytics for the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you on the occasion of this timely and important event. I believe we all agree that long-term emission reductions require political will over the long haul, buy-in by all stakeholders, commitment of financial resources, and advanced planning. This is why I argue that the updated NDCs are the vehicle for providing a roadmap towards bringing this long-term objective from mere words to result. The NDCs now have to be finalized in the midst of an ever more complex setting. The COVID-19 pandemic has and continues to trigger massive disruptions across the globe for everyone and truly everywhere. The toll is especially heavy by the SIDS, LDCs, and LLDCs. Trade, tourism, and remittances have plummeted, if not come to a standstill. Job losses and the accelerated decline in government revenues worsens an already acute debt situation we saw coming prior to the pandemic. Vulnerability is experienced at different levels. This means governments, people are confronted with the storm of a combined health, economic, and climate crisis. The onset of the hurricane season, for example, has already triggered a Category 5 tropical cyclone, Cyclone Harold. It wreaked havoc in Fiji, the Solomon Islands, Tonga, and Vanuatu. An immediate result is that the already scarce domestic resources are diverted from SDG implementation towards emergency plans to address health and humanitarian needs. Short term now dominates action, yet we cannot allow the pandemic to divert our efforts from climate action. Admittedly, it is a challenge, but it is now that we must reconcile short-term needs with long-term requirements to make the future sustainable and inclusive for all. Despite all the challenges they face, these countries have historically made the smallest of historical contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. As an islander myself, I am proud to see how AOSIS and the LDCs have taken exemplary steps in terms of ambition in mitigation. Both groups made important announcements at the Climate Action Summit last September in New York, and they have continued to follow up on them. The LDCs set out a vision to reach net zero GHG emissions by 2050 in the context of resources being available to do so. All SIDS have committed to strategies consistent with the 1.5-degree target, and several have committed to 100% renewable energy by 2030, including through initiatives like SIDS-DOC and SIDS Lighthouse Initiative. The Pacific NDC Hub, launched in 2017, is contributing to help PSIDS on their low-carbon pathways by their high-ambition NDCs and leveraging finance for their implementation. However, the necessary long-term financing must now be put in place. Mobilizing resources on the scale needed will be a challenge, but one we must live up to. As revenues continue to collapse while debt servicing costs go on, governments are forced to make tough choices between providing services to citizens or paying creditors. So far, some countries have succeeded in suspending temporarily bilateral debt servicing costs. But that just means postponing a looming problem. During this moratorium, interest payments continue to accrue and the challenges only increases. This is mere band-aids. Solutions will require political will from all bilateral and multilateral development partners. For example, debt relief or expanding special drawing rights and debt for climate action swaps could support a green recovery while lowering crippling debt burdens. None of us at this time last year saw COVID-19 coming. This pandemic's impact on vulnerable countries' debt challenge is unprecedented in scale and urgency, and this must be reflected in the solutions now urgently to be found. As we battle the spread of the virus, countries across the world are focusing on recovering efforts. As COVID-19 knows no borders, no gender, no race, no religion, so it goes for the impact of climate change. We are in this together, and this implies that recovery efforts and packages must include the most vulnerable. This is one more important wake-up call for all of us to rethink our common future. It is now that we must make the long-term political commitments for a low-carbon future and put in place the corresponding mitigation plans and policies. It is now that we need to put in place the instruments to secure the required long-term financial allocations. I thank you.
I'd like to thank the USG and her team for providing that insightful message. The work of the USG and her office is essential in championing the issues of SIDS and LDCs, and we encourage her and her team to continue these efforts. I know they have some big things planned for this year, and I wish them all of the luck. So moving on, now we'll hear from a very dear colleague of mine, Dr. Jan Sint. Jan is based in Germany and is one of our senior policy analysts. Not only did Jan support several countries in developing their INDCs in 2015, but he's also co-leading our technical assistance to SIDS and LDCs in revising their NDCs this year. Jan, over to you.
Thank you, Fran. I will share my screen and try to share the presentation with you that way. Thanks everybody for joining us. This has been a very interesting intro, and I think we shall get back to this in the discussion in a few moments. But before that, I would like to set the stage a little bit for what we are trying to arrive at in this meeting. And I think we have a very interesting few hours ahead of us. But first of all, back to us. So Climate Analytics is a nonprofit science policy institute established in 2008, as Fran already mentioned, and works to strengthen international capacities to ensure that particularly vulnerable countries can effectively create and implement projects combating climate change and adapting to climate change to some extent. So this has been done with numerous partners. How can I get this out of the way? And I would like to mention particularly the NDC partnership and the International Climate Initiative supported by BMU on behalf of Germany, as well as GIZ and the Green Climate Fund here. I would like to see who's in the audience before we go ahead so that we understand who we are trying to address here. So we would have a quick poll now, and you are kindly requested to respond to that within about 30 seconds, please. And then we move on. I hope everyone can see this poll now and on their own screens. Okay. Just 10 more seconds, please. All right, Nikita, do we have results? Thank you so much. Yeah, this is interesting. Very diverse audience, and with some exposure to both nationally determined contributions and long-term strategies. Indeed, that is very interesting, and a lot of non-governmentals, but also a lot of private sector. That is very good to have a few consultants in the room. Okay, thank you. This is a great audience. I think this also highlights the importance of the topic today really very much. Everybody is kind of affected by this discussion. Okay, so Climate Analytics supported NDC revision in the past and is continuing to do so this year. We are focusing on the engagement and consultation of stakeholders, which is a bit problematic under COVID, obviously. We try to do tailored national climate policy and sectoral analysis, so stuff that is directly relevant for the country and works in their circumstances. Engaging a little bit in energy and transport systems modeling, doing science-based assessments of mitigation potential to inform NDC targets, also their cost assessments, and then we are developing tools, train people, and develop systems to raise awareness, build capacity, and try to enhance knowledge systems in country for data management and then forming MRV down the road, but also strengthening of institutional capacity and basically trying to optimize operational efficiency in the capacity constrained ministries and departments we are working with, mostly in SIDS and LDCs. And we are supporting vulnerability risk assessments and some adaptation components as well. Thanks to that, the number of countries this year around is 6. We are working gratefully with Antigua and Barbuda, Grenada, St. Lucia in the Caribbean, with Benin and Burkina Faso in West Africa, and with Nepal in the Himalaya. We have been working with a few others since 2015 already, and support them with basically similar efforts, only on one NDC each time. So this is where we are trying to improve things along now, looking into the broader perspective. The alignment of LTS and NDCs isn't so complicated, actually. The basic problem we are facing is that we want to know where we are in 2050. So what the LTS, the long-term strategies, are supposed to do for us is inform a pathway to get there. And this directly links to the NDCs, in fact, because they are 5-year installments of the same target, if you wish. However, what we are seeing is many countries who cannot propose the 2050 pathway at this point due to capacity constraints, due to resource constraints, have a harder time to figure out how to get there in time. So how do you design your next NDC, and how do you get to 2050 with these NDCs if they are not aligned with a longer term vision? And we gratefully adapted this from work by the New Climate Institute, which I would like to mention here. You find the link somewhere down there in the slides, probably later in the recording. Visit that site, it's a useful resource. The whole process towards net zero emissions in 2050 has a lot of steps since the Paris Agreement has been developed and the Paris Rulebook is ready. So there are not only the recurrent NDC revisions and new NDCs every 5 years, but there's also the global stocktake that will help us to understand where we are with the NDCs. So how much of the needed emission reductions is already being achieved with the next NDC, and then also how much is still missing and who could do more. Since we are working with an LTS perspective towards 2050, every single one of these NDCs can be informed that way and can draw on insights from 2050 plans. So basically what we are doing is 2 parallel processes, but they are directly linked to each other. Let me go back to that. Because you can, in the same time, use the information you generate for the 2050 targets in smaller installments for each NDC. If you have an idea where you want to go, you can break it down into separate steps that are implementable and go step by step from NDC to NDC. And the whole idea is obviously to be able to get to net zero by 2050. That's a very difficult challenge for many countries. So it's a useful approach to break it down into smaller steps in the NDCs. But on the other hand, a piecemeal approach starting to build one NDC on top of the other is not certain to reach net zero emissions by 2050. So this is basically how the 2 are interrelated. So that in mind, the few NDCs have been submitted so far. Not many, and many will come further down in the year. But it's worth taking a look at how these use the kind of long-term strategy. And I picked 3 here, which I would briefly like to show you. The Marshall Islands have their own LTS in place already and have submitted that to the UNFCCC. You are aware that they are basically proposed to be submitted this year. And you can see in the NDC how they focus entirely on energy and waste energy relationships here. And that is well aligned with where the actual emissions are coming from. So the country is not emitting much in terms of IPPU or FULU. This is industry and this is forestry and land use. There's obviously not much industry in country. So that the emissions come from energy, mainly diesel fuel that they're burning, and from waste decomposition. And so addressing these is a good way of solving your problem long term when you want to go to zero emissions, because you are starting where the emissions are coming from. Rwanda is a little bit different because they don't have an LTS at this point. However, you can see that some of the policies that they have designed and some of the long-term ideas where the country wants to develop can inform your LTS to quite some extent. So they can basically draw on all these and have a long-term vision without an LTS being formulated, really. And I wouldn't be sure if it's a direct consequence, but what you can see is that they are also focusing very much with their emission reductions in the new NDC on the sectors where the emissions are coming from. The difference is that they are tackling all the sectors at once. And this is obviously very constraining on your capacities if you have small ministerial groups working on the sector each. Then we have Chile with a quite ambitious NDC in the first round, and now trying to raise that ambition, obviously, under the presidency. They don't have an LTS either, at least not yet. It's maybe coming someday. And their emission portfolio is similar, more similar to that of the Marshall Islands, with a very high share from energy. And then there is some from the forestry sector, and a little bit from waste and IPPU. And here the focus is on black carbon emissions and basically just a smaller share of that. So this isn't necessarily the big leap forwards. However, the first NDC already did a lot here. And the GHG neutrality target is anchored into the NDC, which is good news. And they have a smaller share of reductions in deforestation and degradation emissions. So they are tackling the right sectors to some extent, but it's not necessarily clear how much more ambitious the next NDC is going to have to be, and if they are on a straight pathway, which is cost effective. And it's important to keep in mind that we are not trying to tell countries where their emission reduction should come from or where their ambition is lying. But the point is that if you have a long-term perspective, it's easier to see how you can get to zero emissions most cost effectively. And it's also easier to consider certain options that might not be possible to implement on very short 5-year cycles. So why is that so important? I think what we see is that many projects take more than 5 years to implement. Take, for instance, geothermal in the OECS. If you want to install projects like that, OECS, by the way, is the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. If you want to install projects like that, which are normally high investment cost and large scale, they can transform your entire sector. So they were very helpful to get to zero emissions. However, as the people from these countries can tell you, it's very difficult to pull these off in cycles of 5 to 10 years even. It takes a long time. And if you have a clearer perspective that you want to go to zero emissions by 2050, you can plan with these projects and say that you get them online in 2040, which isn't possible for a short-term NDC that doesn't have this target. And the same holds for hydroelectric projects in many cases. There are small and bigger ones, but the bigger ones that are possibly also very valuable for energy storage, so you can use them as basically pumping batteries, are taking a lot of time too, and lots of planning particularly, so that you need this longer time frame in order to be able to use them. And what we are seeing is that many NDCs are now trying to work with rather small scale projects, hence solar is so attractive. Simply because they do not have the capacity and they do not have the time to develop something that is more transformative on a bigger scale, so that these get lost on the way sometimes. And then there is another aspect that sometimes technologies aren't ripe for market implementation just yet. So they would need a little bit more venture capital maybe, and need to attract a little bit more science and a little bit more experimentation. And for these, you obviously need a longer term perspective as well. If you have like 5 years and the project isn't even in the stage where it can leave the university, some of these ideas will never get used. And it's also noteworthy that some of these are dropping in their implementation costs over time, so that they might be very useful in the longer term and might not be considered for a long-term strategy today, but since these are supposed to be flexible enough, could be considered later on, so that you are more technology open in a way. And that speaks to the point that solar power and wind power costs have dropped tremendously over the last few years, which nobody has seen coming, basically. Okay, so what are some of the challenges and opportunities in linking NDCs to LTS? You see, maybe agree that this is crucial. We should discuss that for a second. I think the main challenges are for SIDS and LDCs in particular the capacity constraints to develop both at one point in time in short notice, basically. So you get some project funding to start your NDC revision, mainly 1 or 1.5 years before submitting. And that basically takes up a lot of your capacity in the ministry, that strains your stakeholders that you need to engage. And that basically means you have a hard time in simultaneously developing your LTS. Obviously, there is an opportunity in that because the long-term planning allows for an easier allocation of the 5-year installments, as I hinted at, and you can basically have one bigger process breaking down your NDCs for the next couple of years and aligning with what you are preparing with your stakeholders for the long-term strategy with your NDC. You basically just need to meet them once, but you still need kind of the project funding and the support, advisory or technical or staff in the ministry from international donors to pull it off, which is the same problem with the NDCs, basically. Then you have difficulties to access this kind of finance for large-scale transformational projects that I just presented, and particularly on the 5-year NDCs. It's challenging all the time, but it's most complicated if you have short time frames and you haven't readily developed your projects before putting them into your NDC planning. And there the LTS can help as well because it provides a clear signal to the private sector. And financing with longer planning horizons is much easier because obviously the returns to these investments will materialize over longer than 5 years. And that means, on the one hand, the private sector understands there is a strong policy conviction and hence may be interested more in investing. And on the other hand, that the investments can also be paid off in the time period in which you are planning for this, which helps you on the next challenge as well, because normally if you have these very small projects, you need to follow up on all these. You have a very long project pipeline with small solar and wind projects maybe, and you need to seek funding for any of these small ones and need to monitor how they produce energy output over time, how they are developing in the field, and how they are kind of comparing to your targets even in your NDC. And these small projects obviously take a lot more capacity than if you just had a bigger one. So basically, the idea would be look into more transformative projects, but understand that these need longer periods of time to implement, and then the long-term strategy can help you with both. And finally, not to forget that the LTS is a living document. It's not supposed to be set in stone how you get to your net zero emissions or target that you might have for 2050. But you can thereby still provide increased clarity on the financial support needed because you can have a longer term perspective than just for the NDC. And before I hand over to the panel, I would like to give a brief outlook of the strategic ideas behind long-term strategies. So as I said, it's a living document that provides a framework for NDC targets, and that's important to notice, I think, for the next round of NDC revision. The multi-stakeholder engagement processes are key, and even the interministerial coordination is working much easier probably now under COVID situation because many of the other meetings are cancelled. But it's harder now to reach out to the communities and to the people who are actually affected. And this is extremely important because we don't want to lose people on the way, and you have to have an ear on the ground on what kind of interventions could be supported by your electorate or by your country. And this engagement needs to continue. It cannot be just a one-off and then you have a document and put that on the shelf, but you have to have a repeated process here, which doesn't hurt much because you have to repeat the same thing for the NDCs if you want to have buy-in for them on a broader scale anyways. Then it's important that you have coherence across climate action, data, modeling, and also your development pathway. So everything needs to work in tandem in a way, and there shouldn't be many leftover discrepancies when you develop your LTS. It helps you to align all of that. Obviously, it requires large-scale planning support and also implementation finance, after all, and to get the long-term strategy into the ground so that you could build those power plants that you are planning for. and that you could develop an LTS that actually attracts that kind of funding. And the NDCs are linked to implementation plans and reporting requirements quite strongly. So the LTS is linked to that kind of strategy, how you want to develop your NDC on the ground into something that benefits your country, into something that actually reduces emissions on the ground, rather than just the approach. Not only because the long-term strategy helps you to convince the private sector that there is an interest in your country to develop in a certain way and not another, reduce stranded assets that way as well, but also because obviously some of the larger donors like the Green Climate Fund are looking for projects that are actually transformational. And here you can see an opportunity, if you switch to these longer timeframes, to also switch to bigger projects that are easily, arguably transformational in comparison to the small steps. Yes, and the long-term strategy supports de-risking innovative technologies in countries that are not able to put up the capital investment themselves in a way, because you can attract finance for longer term undertakings more easily, but you can also kind of try to get the international donor support, at least for certain interventions you want to make, more easily, so that new technologies have an easier chance to actually be implemented and used, like the seawater ocean cooling or the OTAC we discussed. And finally, I think it's important that LTS should include the SDG linkages. So how's your development plan looking at as Rwanda did it basically without having an LTS? And how can you ensure, if you are transitioning into this green economy stage, that you take every job that you need into this new age, that you take the people with you? So basically have a just transition into an economy that is Paris aligned. And I think this couldn't be overstated, really, that we need to continuously keep everyone confident and aware what to expect, as well as where to develop their skills as well, and not just short-termist NDC style adjustments, but longer-term strategies will inform these kind of developments. And if you have a workforce that can in the future support the green economy, it's much easier to get buy-in as well. So I guess I leave it there for now and hand back over to Fran. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan, for your presentation. Very informative. So we were going to take a couple questions, a couple minutes to answer any questions that participants might have regarding the presentation. And we already have a few questions. Jan, I don't know if you want to answer any of these now or follow through into the panel discussion. One question that I think will be interesting for you as well as the panelists is, what guarantee is there that long-term strategy will be condoned or implemented by successive governments, which are generally in power for 5-year or possibly max 10 years? And should long-term strategies being anchored in law to ensure that they're implemented over time?
Yes, I think that is a very valuable and good question indeed. I want to take that. Yeah. So one thing is, if you want a living document in a way, it's very difficult to enshrine it in law. But on the other hand, there is an opportunity to do it in a different way. You could enshrine the final net zero emissions target in 2050. And some countries are even considering adding that to their constitutions, if you are so skeptical about how governments will follow up on the promises of previous governments. And I understand that is a huge problem. But on the other hand, I mean, if the long-term strategy really helps you develop a strong pathway how you want to change your economy, it should also help you to attract private sector investment and to convince companies not to invest in stranded assets. So that you see in some countries, for instance, in my home country, Germany, that after all, the economy is going to push the policymakers in a certain direction, and you will suddenly find those who haven't been fond of greening the economy arguing for a rapid transition because that is what their company leaders tell them. I mean, that would be my short answer, but I'm happy to discuss that further. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. So cognizant of the time and wanting to be able to give enough time for our panel discussion and for our panelists to give some introductory remarks, I will move on to that component of the day. So please, panelists, if you could put on your videos and so we can see your wonderful faces. Thank you. And so to introduce our very distinguished panel, who all are experts in their field. First, we have Ms. Uname Gordon. She is the Principal Director of the Climate Change Division in the Government of Jamaica and is also their GCF Nationally Designated Authority. She's not just an expert in her field, but she's a staunch supporter of building regional capacity and expertise within the Caribbean, and I can wholeheartedly support that effort. Jamaica has already submitted their NDC and is also currently working on their long-term strategy. Welcome, Uname. And next we have Kelly Levin. Kelly is a senior associate at the World Resources Institute's Global Climate Program. Her work focuses on supporting countries in the design and tracking of climate commitments, as well as planning for long-term transitions associated with decarbonisation. Kelly has written a variety of pieces on NDCs, long-term strategies, net zero targets, and as of just 4 days ago, published a commentary on the relationship between NDCs and LTS. So very timely to have you on the panel. Next, we have Naranda Maurice George. Naranda is a regional consultant for the Caribbean with the Green Climate Fund, and previously was the regional advisor with the GCF. Prior to which, Naranda worked in the Department of Sustainable Development and Environment in the government of St. Lucia and has been following and engaging in the climate change field for many, many years. She's also a certified expert in climate adaptation finance and obviously in climate finance in general. And last but most certainly not least, we have Amanda McKee. Amanda is the head of the NDC Partnerships Climate Action Enhancement Package and also the head of knowledge management for the NDC Partnership Support Unit. Prior to which, Amanda led knowledge management efforts in the Green Growth Knowledge Platform. It's a global partnership between GGGI, the OECD, UN Environment, the World Bank, and over 60 international organizations, research institutes, and think tanks. And so through the CAP, Amanda has great insight into a lot of country requests and their processes that are going on in country right now. So thank you all for joining and welcome. To start off, I am going to hand the floor to Uname to give some introductory remarks on our subject today. Over to you.
Thank you, Fran. It's good to see so many familiar faces in a panel, all-female panel. Let us not be lost on us. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon from where you are. And I want to really thank Climate Analytics for inviting Jamaica to share with you in this very interesting panel. And in these very few remarks, I will attempt to answer probably, as I address the subject, one of the questions that we've been asked over and over and over. How did we get the NDC out in this challenging time of COVID? As you all know, Jamaica submitted its NDC at the end of June this year. And if you examine the NDC itself, you realize that it is grounded in increased ambition. And so how did we get there? In addition to the challenges that I see that was articulated by Jan in his presentation, one of our major challenges was to decide and define clearly what ambition means and what increased ambition means and what this means, and then to translate that to the Jamaican people for buy-in, which was important, so that we could engage them in the process. Once this hurdle was overcome, we agreed that we needed increased ambition to have more ambitious targets, where the process itself was very transparent, and that the quality of the data that we were going to use was sound. Those were some of the things that had to be decided and articulated. So the process began with the notion that updating the NDC would have to be linked with an investment plan. But at the same time, we needed to have clear understanding that we wanted to move based on the timelines towards net zero and to chart this 2050 pathways in line with the Paris Agreement goals. Challenge, therefore, was really to decide what data exists and how to model the data to get what we want and to what year. And so you will notice that a crucial feature of the Jamaica NDC is that it is based on real analytical work of the policies, and it's grounded really in ambitious commitments that the country already made and have already made. And this was ensuring the robustness of the document, but also enjoying the political support and the implementation plans that were already in place for these policies. There was a clear roadmap and a strategy that was linked also to a 4-point climate finance strategy that we developed in executing the climate agenda in Jamaica. And this 4-point strategy is very simple. It was increasing our capacity to plan for climate finance. So the GCF country program, the development of the NAP and the RED Plus strategy. It was increasing our capacity to access finance. So to look for GCF accreditation and to look at different financial instruments. Increasing our capacity to deliver this finance. So how do we crowd in the private sector, and how do we look to the CSOs on the ground to advance an NDC when it was developed. And it was also how would we monitor and report and verify this finance, but also going forward. Fortunately for us, and I must here highlight the work that we're doing with the NDC partnership, because fortunately for us, when we were in this planning stage, the CAPE was launched, the CAPE support was launched, and just when we were fine-tuning that strategy of the NDC, the long-term strategy, we were able to develop and structure our CAPE activity to meet these needs that were articulated in the NDC plan. So Jamaica is using the enhanced NDC as a platform for developing the long-term, what we now call the long-term low emission and climate resilience strategy. And I would close by saying that the plan is articulated, the NDC is there. We are in the process of developing the long-term strategy. The CAPE products are in, the international partners have been confirmed, and the support of our international partners will be paramount as we attempt in a nutshell to really de-link economic growth from the development, from emission reduction. I think that's the final thought, that we want to really de-link as we go forward, while also moving towards this climate resilient society. So I would end by saying, herein lies the intertwining that this webinar is all about. Thank you, Fran.
Thank you, Uname, especially for outlining some of the challenges that you have faced nationally in trying to do both your NDC and your long-term strategy. Granted, maybe not directly in parallel, but on top of each other. and understanding that data not only is essential, but data is most certainly challenging. And in times where capacity is constrained and stretched, especially under this global pandemic, it's a lot to ask your fellow ministries. So thank you for your efforts and your thoughts. And then I think that we will come back to you with a couple of questions. I believe that a couple of those that are posed by some of the participants will be well placed for you to answer. So on to our next panelist, I'm going to hand the floor to Kelly from WRI. Kelly, as I outlined previously, has worked substantively on not just NDCs, but also long-term strategies. And Kelly's going to share a short presentation with us. and likely will answer in doing so potentially a couple of these questions, because I believe that they'll be covered by the substance you'll be speaking to. Kelly, over to you.
Sure, terrific. Thanks, Fran. Thanks, Jan, and all of the Climate Analytics team for inviting me to join this very important webinar today. If you go to the next slide, please. I'm going to be talking about aligning NDCs and LTS, and this is just a visual of what we're talking about. So in this picture, all of the strategies, the lines are achieving more or less the same 2030 emissions, but only the long-term strategies are really setting the course for a long-term emissions neutrality trajectory in the second half of the century. So here, the extent to which short or medium-term goal aligns with the long-term decarbonization goals are going to really depend on the types of policies and plans and investments taken. So in the dotted line, you'll see here, you're meeting the NDC, for example, you're replacing coal-fired power plants with natural gas and increasing fuel efficiency, but you're not taking it to the next level in terms of replacing coal-fired power plants with zero emissions power generation or replacing conventional vehicles with electric vehicles. And this is really the question of how do you steer that long-term trajectory and link it with short-term targets. If you go to the next slide, please. There are a lot of benefits in terms of linking the NDCs and LTS, but I just wanted to mention that there are some really significant differences between the two documents, which present some challenges as well, which Jan had referred to. So first and foremost, they have distinct timelines, but beyond that, they also serve distinct functions. So NDCs are much more closely tied to implementation, for example, than LTS, which are often much more visionary. LTS are also voluntary under the Paris Agreement, while the agreement states that countries shall prepare and communicate NDCs. And although there is a mandate under the agreement for accounting and tracking and reporting of progress and review of NDCs, that's not the case for LTS. And finally, there is a clear means and timeline for updating NDCs, but that doesn't exist for LTS. And the legal character between the two documents differs. So that's some context in terms of the ways in which they can and also pose challenges to linking. If you go to the next slide, please. But nevertheless, there are some significant benefits of aligning NDCs and LTS. First, doing so can ensure that they're both mutually coherent and consistent. So if they're instead treated as completely unrelated, distinct processes, there's a risk that they could actually conflict with each other. So the NDC, for example, could spur investments in a certain technology that makes the achievement of a long-term goal much more difficult. And accordingly, if the NDCs take into account the long-term goals in the long-term strategies, the lock-in of carbon-intensive or non-resilient infrastructure or technology and behavior could be avoided. So you can, as a result, cut some costs by investing in the appropriate infrastructure that's not going to need to be phased out later. Furthermore, alignment can reduce costs and increase efficiency in the planning processes. So some of the underlying processes involved in updating the NDC and developing the long-term strategy, whether it's data collection or modeling or stakeholder consultation, could be undertaken together where relevant. Go to the next slide, please. We sketch out a few different scenarios, which is going to pose either some, ease or challenges in aligning this. The first is that a country has a long-term strategy, and this is the ideal case. So the established long-term strategy could be used as the basis for enhancing the NDC. The second scenario is that the country is in the process of developing both at the same time, the LTS and updating the NDC. In this situation, some aspects of the development process, for example, stakeholder consultation or data collection, could be pursued jointly depending on different timelines, but at a minimum, it would be good to have some kind of mechanism to review the alignment on a regular basis to ensure that the plans are finalized in a coherent way. The third scenario is that a country doesn't plan to submit an LTS, but it will update the NDC much more quickly. And in this case, it's certainly worth ensuring that the short-term policies and investments don't lock in carbon-intensive technologies, and the lack of an LTS shouldn't hold up the process of updating the NDC. if you go to the next slide, different countries are going to fall into different categories. So here, the status of LTS so far, and if you go to the next slide, the status of NDC updates, and you'll see that the countries, don't necessarily overlap. So where a given country is in those scenarios is really going to differ quite significantly. If you go to the next slide, this is my last slide. But nevertheless, depending on where you are in those scenarios, there are a few opportunities for enhancing alignment. The first is with regard to governance, and Jan had touched on this a bit as well. And it's worth considering whether, for example, the NDC update and the LTS could be led by the same institution, or whether coordination mechanisms or stakeholder processes could be joined and pursued jointly. The second is with regard to modeling and analysis. It stands to reason that the LTS and NDCs are going to be informed by a common set of underlying data and analysis, assuming also the path dependency of 2050 outcomes on the situation in 2030. So there could be a common set of modeling scenarios and approaches that are pursued. The third is target setting. Ideally, one would put forward an ambitious long-term goal, which would also then inform the interim milestones, including for 2030 and the updated NDC. And to the extent that that is not possible, at least NDCs could consider adopting sector-specific targets that would align with benchmarks for longer-term trajectories. The next opportunity is with regard to the prioritization of policies and actions. A long-term strategy typically doesn't have a full implementation roadmap, but policies and actions are typically necessary to achieve the visions and goals of the long-term strategy, as well as the NDC. So they could be developed in a way to inform sector-specific action in a coherent way. And lastly, with regard to transparency, it can be advantageous to communicate both the enhanced NDC and long-term strategies with a consistent categorization of information so that stakeholders can easily understand it. And in addition to communicating common elements, where relevant, it can also be helpful to explain how the documents relate to one another. If you just go to the end with my contact information, I'm going to pause there, but I think just to wrap up, to say that long-term strategies and NDCs are really designed to work hand in hand to steer countries in their development towards alignment with the ambitious goals put forward by the Paris Agreement. And there are many means to do that, and we really look forward to seeing the ways in which countries pursue this effort in the future. Thanks again to Climate Analytics.
Thank you, Kelly. Very much appreciative of that presentation, and also the work that you've done. I would highly encourage participants and attendees to read the piece that Kelly just recently did. It's on the WR website, specifically about linking NDCs and LTS. I think it was just published just a couple of days ago. And with that, I'm going to now move to a slightly different perspective. Naranda. Naranda is, like I previously said, from the Green Climate Fund, and focusing her work mainly in the Caribbean, but obviously has a global perspective with the fund and with how the biggest climate financing institute globally is responding to some of these challenges. So Naranda, I'm going to hand over to you for some of your remarks.
Well, thank you, Fran, and Climate Analytics for inviting the Green Climate Fund to make some interventions during this panel on behalf of the Executive Director, Mr. Yannick Lemerek, and the Director of Country Programming, Mr. Pa Usman. We are very happy to provide some insight on how the Green Climate Fund is supporting developing countries in their commitments to the Paris Agreement, particularly on NDCs and in terms of long-term planning towards decarbonization. Next slide, please. So the Green Climate Fund, we know, is part of the financial mechanism of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the largest climate change fund And in its short lifetime, it has established a project portfolio valued at $6.2 billion across 106 countries, including in SIDS. The GCF strives to assist developing countries in improving their resilience. And so far, we can say that for at least 394 million people, we are doing so. And also, these projects have been contributing to 1 gigaton of CO2 equivalent emissions reductions. Next slide, please. From among 30 SIDS have benefited from $818.1 million, leveraging $1.2 billion in co-financing for 29 projects, with 24 currently under implementation, which represents 13% of the GCF's project portfolio. Next slide, please. As it relates to readiness, the fund has at least 100 approved proposals for SIDS to a value of $59.7 million, with 90 of those being disbursed, totaling $27.4 million. Next slide, please. The fund has also been instrumental in supporting countries in climate resilient recovery. And under readiness, there are 3 windows that have been strategically designed to support that. There's the rapid readiness window where countries can get allocations from the 100 million annual allocation. And we try to process that in a period of 60 days. And these must be for a duration of 1 year in terms of implementation, between 6 months to 1 year. There's also another window where we provide flexible and additional resources for grants which were already under implementation when we got hit with COVID. And some countries have actually tried to access these and requested extensions of time to help them implement, because we know, of course, that COVID did impact implementation, not only for GCF projects, but all across implementation for other funds as well. And also, GCF continued to provide technical support via capacity building, utilizing a roster of experts that the fund has in place to support countries in elaborating their project concepts for readiness. Next slide, please. So GCF is keen to continue this support to countries, and in terms of its portfolio has adopted an adaptive management approach. And of course, I just spoke to the rapid financial support facility that has been outlined. In addition to that, the fund is seeking to accelerate the approval of projects that are speaking to climate resilient recovery at our upcoming boards. And specifically speaking to NDCs, across the 101 countries that we support, support for NDCs can be provided through our country programming process and our entity work programs. Concept notes that factor in addressing the NDC targets, updating NDCs and enhancing them, and as well as targeting sectoral strategies and investment plans to implement NDCs. And additionally, to create an enabling environment for NDC implementation. Of course, long-term strategies are also part of the feature if countries want to access readiness resources to support them in elaborating those. Next slide, please. So the fund also recognizes there's a need to provide enhanced support for NDCs. I mean, there has been a call for it by countries. The board at its 13th meeting has identified that we do have the modalities to enable support for the preparation and implementation of nationally determined contributions, implementation and ambition in developing countries. Next slide, please. So in so doing, the Country Programming Division has been engaging with our partners and sought to provide two modalities through which countries can enhance their NDCs. And the two partners that we've approached are the GGGI and UNDP. We have outlined a number of areas that can potentially fit into a package of support. Of course, countries are free to choose any combination of those. And where we are with this phase right now is that the partners, GGGI and UNDP, are currently engaging with countries to field their interest in pursuing this kind of support. Next slide, please. In addition to that, we have again recognized that it is important to provide technical assistance to countries. And so we have this facility, which we call the second modality of enhanced NDC support. And countries can get support for national consultations to engage stakeholders, convening decision-making authorities. We heard the question about how do we get that commitment, and validating the revised NDCs, as well as having and commencing conversations on long-term strategies if that is what the country desires to do. Continued work on analysis and assessments and development of an ambitious NDC pathway, and of course, improving knowledge management in this area, and not forgetting to kickstart NDC implementation through the investment action plans. And I think at this point, I will stop here with my remarks, and we will take any additional questions and try to address it. But I think at this point, this provides a general frame through which the Green Climate Fund tries to engage countries in addressing both NDCs and long-term strategies.
Thank you so much, Naranda. And I believe that in your intervention, you definitely answered a couple of the questions that had been actually submitted prior to our event starting. So thank you for that. And also for giving us some insight into how the GCF is responding to the needs of countries and being innovative going forward as we look to some of the challenges that we're seeing. So last, but most certainly not least, Amanda, I'm going to give you the floor to speak a little bit to how the partnership and the Climate Action Enhancement Package is seeing this interlinkage and the work that you're doing on the same. So Amanda, over to you.
Great, thank you, Fran. And thank you to Climate Analytics for organizing today's event. I have the blessing and the curse, I think, of coming last in this fantastic panel of speakers. So a lot of, I think the really important points have been made, and I'm gonna try to give a little bit of a different perspective on things. So the NDC partnership is a global coalition of countries and organizations working really to collaboratively fast track the implementation of NDCs and support countries' efforts to raise their ambition over time. We have over 180 members, Climate Analytics, WRI, Jamaica are all members, and we work really at the service of countries. So helping to surface the support needs that they have and align the technical and financial support from our partners to meet those. So the primary support that we're providing is really helping to ensure that countries are actioning their NDCs so that they're moving from paper to planning to implementation. But more and more, we're starting to see requests that take the NDC even further. So this past year, requests around raising the ambition of the NDC, but also requests to set out priorities for long-term planning. I am definitely not a long-term strategy expert, and as with all of the work that we do, we really rely on our partners to provide the expertise. But our role within the partnership support unit, as I mentioned, is really about aligning the support. And so I want to talk about a little bit today some of the trends that we're seeing. There are really two links that I want to highlight to start between the NDCs and the LTS. The first one, that we really see the LTS as important to bring national climate planning to fruition. So it helps to ground the NDC in national plans and really support its implementation. On the flip side, the LTS itself can actually be a really important tool to help inform future NDC enhancements, ensure that they are ambitious and leading in the right direction. With so much at stake, it's really important that our plan or our course is charted carefully. And if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. So the LTS, I would see it actually as giving countries the direction that they need. So it's the road. So if you think about that fantastic chart that Kelly showed, the LTS is the road. And once the direction is set, you can get there using the NDC more easily. So the NDC itself is actually the car. So you might need to upgrade your car every once in a while. You might need to switch out your driver. But once you know where you're headed, you can adjust your speed. You can really focus on how you're going to get there. So last year, and actually if we can go back one slide, last year we launched the Climate Action Enhancement Package to support countries in their NDC update efforts. So we really encouraged countries to take a broad view on their NDC enhancement, including links to other national planning processes, mainstreaming gender, ensuring that whole of government or whole of society approaches were taking place, as well as explicit support to actually raise the country's climate ambition. We received requests for support from 63 countries through CAP. And even though this support was not directed at LTS, nearly half of those countries, 30, included at least one activity within their CAP request that focuses on LTS. Outside of the CAP process, through our regular country engagement process, we received requests for support from countries around the implementation of their NDC. And over the past year, we've received 8 additional requests from countries looking to incorporate LTS into their implementation activities. So really, there's a growing number of countries that are requesting this type of support and linking it directly to the NDC process. These requests we're seeing are fairly well supported. So about 80% of these CAP requests have confirmed support, and it's coming from a wide range of partners. We have 40 implementing partners that are providing financial and technical support through CAP, and 17 of them are responding to at least one of these LTS focused activities. That being said, the total amount of funding being directed to those activities is about $1.1 million US, which is only 2.5% of the total value of what we're providing through CAP this year. Next slide, please. So I mentioned there's a lot of countries who are requesting this support, but what we're seeing is that it's actually across most countries a very small proportion of the support that they're requesting through CAP. So we have a few countries who've actually built their entire CAP application around the LTS. So Argentina and Chile are 2 examples who will be receiving a lot of support on their LTS through CAP. But we have other countries who really integrated it within the NDC support as well. And Una may give the example of Jamaica earlier. If we can go to the next slide, please. So while LTS makes up a small proportion of what we're seeing in CAP, it's very well supported by partners. And so if you look at overall country requests, about 80% of the requests on LTS are receiving support. That number drops slightly if we narrow down to look at LDCs, and it drops even further if we narrow down and look at just SIDS. So while the overall figure is quite positive, I wanted to highlight that there are some gaps in support that we are seeing. And then the last slide, I wanted to just say a really quick word on the timing. We've heard a couple of mentions of COVID and the impact there. Through the outreach that we've been doing with our implementing partners on CAP, we've been keeping track of how the work is progressing. And so far, it looks like about 50% of the activities that are taking place through CAP on LTS are on track. So really only half of them are on track. 44 are reported as delayed, and the rest are reported either as complete or other. So there is a significant amount of delay that's taking place in the support. But I think this is also really to be expected. One way that we're really seeing a lot of the support efforts react and respond to COVID is by resequencing activities. And so some of the activities that might have taken place at the beginning might be pushed to the end of the NDC update process, when it will be easier to be on the ground, to collect data, to convene the right stakeholders, to do the validation processes that need to take place. So we're currently, the graph on the left is showing you the start dates of when these LTS activities are starting under CAP. And most of them, this actually follows the same trend as what we see with our NDC enhancement support overall. So in a normal world, we see that countries are really approaching their LTS hand in hand and really in parallel with their NDC update. But with COVID, we are seeing a little bit of delays there. So I'll leave it at that and turn it back to you, Fran. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda, especially for providing some insight into actual country requests as they were thinking and formulating how to take on the challenge of 2020, and also to provide an update as to how those activities and the implementation of them have been challenged by the global pandemic that we're currently facing. So thank you very much for that. So I'm going to ask, thank you so much to all participants for sharing quite a few very interesting questions. And so I encourage panelists to, one, reflect on those when I also ask you questions. I will point a few of them towards you, but also feel free to type an answer as you see fit. So I'll also encourage our panelists to put back on your videos as we go into a bit more of a discussion. The first question that I am going to pose is to Uname. One of the questions that was posed in the chat, and also something that I personally wanted to ask you, is, you know, as you've submitted your NDC and you're going about developing your long-term strategy. It's a question that was posed from a participant. How are you going about engaging stakeholders in a meaningful way about something that is happening 30 years down the line, but also ensuring that it's anchored in today and in reality, and then that it can't be undermined by the successive future governments? There was a question specifically whether, you know, that should be legislated. Basically, how are you tackling that nationally to ensure that you achieve those ambitious goals, but also look and engage stakeholders for the future?
Thank you, Fran. That's always an interesting question, but one of the things, as I said at the beginning, is that we had to translate at the beginning of the process what increased ambition means for the Jamaican people. And I think what we have been able to do is, using an old Jamaican, so almost culturalize the NDC, because everybody knows what the NDC is, but nobody really identified with it. And so in connecting the dots for the Jamaican people and the buy-in, we were able to almost use our culture, which we are famous for, and to say, ambition, raising ambition in the context of Jamaica means something for the Jamaican people. It's an old cultural saying that your grandmother used to say, you need to have ambition. And so we use that to explain it away, to say, this is what we need to do. This is how. Raising ambition for us in the Jamaican context is aligned to success. If you have ambition, then you are successful. So when your grandmother says you need to have ambition, she means that you need to take steps to be successful. And so we have been able to sell the NDC in that way, to say this is where we are going, and then to tie that to the process. In addition, there are policies, if you notice, as I said, that there are policies that the government of Jamaica is already committed to, and there are processes in place. The National Energy Policy, which goes across administration 2009 to 2030, that's a policy that already exists, that has already gone through the parliament. So we didn't go about looking for new targets or so. We looked at what we have and grown the NDC in that way, in the culture, but in what we already have. And that has worked very well for us in terms of the Jamaican people understanding and having the buy-in and the constant engagement every single step of the way. And the enhancement process took us an entire year. We had major consultation, cross-cultural consultation, group consultation, sectoral consultation. We looked at the data, what data exists. We explained to even the sectors themselves who thought that there should have been or could have been. We had to explain to them that the data that was available was not credible enough, and then made a commitment to also tie that to the next commitment period, which would be 5 years, and to promise to work with them to get there. So part of the process is to, and part of the long-term process is to work with the sectors like an agriculture sector, like a tourism sector, to get to the next period where we think we will have increased ambition, as we call it. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you, Unume. And I might follow on to Kelly to get a bit of your perspective on a similar question. Basically, noting that long-term strategies are supposed to be living documents. You know, you're supposed to take stock of that as you go forward, as you implement your 5-year cycles, and taking and seeing how far you are along the way. One of the questions from participants was about whether long-term strategies should be anchored in law to ensure that they are implemented over time. But given the nature of how we've been discussing this, is that a best practice? And in addressing that, I wanted to also ask, where in kind of your work, where have you seen some of the challenges and best practices around that to ensure that the long-term strategy and defining that long-term goal helps the 5-year cycles, and then also helps to inform the global stocktake?
Thanks so much. It's a great question. And we've actually put together a paper with support from the 2050 Pathways platform on governance aspects of long-term strategy. I'll put it in the chat right afterwards, but it looked into a lot of the different, we analyzed the LTS that had been submitted already and looked at which ones, for example, had put together a law or used some other policy vehicle, and which ones had engaged which kind of ministries and stakeholder processes, et cetera. So that might be informative. I think in general, it will depend on a country context, but broadly speaking, laws are typically ways in most countries that have some durable policy outcomes. And I'll take the United States, for example, that under the Obama administration put forward a mid-century climate strategy. And then with the change of administration, you can, kind of hardly find the document anymore. So this is a case in point where, had you had an instrument that had, more legal basis, it would have been stronger. But I'd say there are other means for trying to ensure that there's some kind of durability of the long-term strategy, and it can withstand political upheaval. One of it is ensuring that multiple ministries are involved in the development of it, especially those that have power in processes such as the planning and finance ministry, and also to the extent that you can get buy-in from some of the top executive branches, that can be helpful. So I think one is just to make sure that it is incredibly well socialized, but also co-created with multiple ministries. That's what we have seen. in some country examples. The other is a really robust stakeholder process, so that it's not just a few people with a few experts who are developing this, but that this is really something that comes from citizens and is demanded from citizens, and that they will support it no matter if there are changes in administration later on. So those are some means for doing that. I guess the only other thing that I'll mention is that unlike the NDCs, which have a cycle for revision under the Paris Agreement, that doesn't exist for long-term strategies right now. And one question I think that is going to be quite relevant for a COP26 decision is to what extent there will be appetite for ensuring that there is a moment in which long-term strategies can be revised, and that there is pressure to do so, because otherwise it will be up to every single country, and certainly some countries will take that opportunity, but it would be nice to continuously have these moments in which countries are revamping and looking at the latest science and latest technology developments and what have you, to ensure that the long-term strategies truly are living documents as they were intended to be. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Kelly. And now switching the angle a little bit to the support that's required and needed and available for countries to develop their NDCs, implement them, and also develop and move towards their mid-century decarbonisation strategies. One question, and I'm not sure if it's better placed with Amanda or Niranda, was about what are some of the gaps that are being seen in budgetary planning and allocation for climate-related actions, and how that should link to NDC planning. I know that there were several activities that were requested under the CAP that supported financial planning, whether it be tagging of budget activities, climate tagging of budget activities, aligning your public sector investment programs with your NDC, which is a very challenging task, but one that is interesting, especially under a couple of articles under the Paris Agreement, and looking forward to some of those requirements about aligning climate finance with the Paris Agreement. So maybe Niranda, what additional support is available from the GCF to support in some of this innovative, required innovative thinking and planning, especially for SIDS and LDCs who have historically faced challenges in accessing climate finance due to capacity constraints, not just nationally, but regionally. And has this been started to be discussed within the board, the GCF board, or even within the Secretariat as we now look forward to the implementation of NDCs and achieving that real transformational change?
Thank you, Fran. So for the whole issue of tracking climate finance and tagging, etc., whether it's NDCs or adaptation, whichever area, we have seen that SIDS have commenced looking at that, and we have quite a number of readiness proposals that have these elements as a component. Mapping and climate finance tracking, budgetary private sector, trying to get a whole picture of what's going on in the country so that the countries can better prioritize and strategize going forward. Some of our countries in the Caribbean have hosted the NDC Forum, where they have developed, well, there was a conference in St. Lucia a couple of years ago where partners were brought together jointly with the OECS Commission, and I believe climate analytics was also a part of that. So countries identified what their needs are. They put together some documents and proposal on what they perceive to be their financing needs on the way forward, and in potential investors and people were brought together to determine an interest. So that's one. And there's also the aspect of the readiness resources, which are actually helping countries to map out. So you have Haiti, you have Jamaica, St. Lucia, Bahamas, countries, Antigua and Barbuda, beginning to look at how we really track both the budgetary allocation, not only the inflows, but what government also put into the process. And as a very dynamic and fluid process, but we know one thing that is being prioritized right now in this climate, and virtually so, our last board meeting was virtually held, is to prioritize project approvals. And we have at the last board, for example, seen an approved project for a SID, Haiti, that was actually directly contributing to its NDC target in terms of the scaling smart solar energy access microgrids in Haiti, which is supposed to have a mitigation potential of 404 tons of CO2 equivalent. And so that project, where GCF contributed 9.9 million, is leveraging $35.9 million. So work is already ongoing, and the Secretariat is already involved in helping countries try to target that. Aside from that, I spoke in my presentation to the various areas of technical capacity and technical assistance that is providing all directly to the national designated authorities of the GCF, NDAs, as well as direct access entities. So for example, in the Caribbean region, we have the 5Cs and we have the Caribbean Development Bank as two regional direct access entities, and we have the Department of Environment in Antigua and Barbuda as a national direct access entity, and we have the PACT in Belize. We have a number of them in the pipeline across the region, and as well for all the other seats, I believe. So what is happening is that because of the capacity constraints, GCF has also opened up a window to allow them to get technical assistance support in elaborating the concept notes and to help them co-develop. So they're not, in some instances, they're not actually writing it for them, but there was a question, you know, how do we ensure that we have this capacity? So you're actually working with the countries, working with the direct access entities to help them elaborate that so they understand how to put these together to be able to attract. Because one of the big issues over the past few years is to define the climate rationale and strengthen it. So this is an area that SIDS can get support in to make sure that when your proposal is submitted, it goes through. And the access that we're looking for is in the bag. Thanks.
Thank you, Naranda. I may just have one follow-up question there. And it's one that came out through the last couple of slides of Jan's presentation. And one of the main objectives or goals of the GCF is to provide innovative solutions and to allow for de-risking of investments to make transformational change in country. How have you seen, or do you have any case studies or best practices with dealing with technologies that are not yet competitive or mature? You know, it's for example, with OTEC or geothermal. I mean, there are a few projects in the pipeline for geothermal in the region, at least in the Caribbean, and it is most certainly a challenge. How would you go about recommending some best practices on de-risking or selling innovative, not yet mature technologies to help that long-term transition?
Thank you, Fran. This is a bit of a tricky question, but the long and short of it is that the private sector facility of the Green Climate Fund does have that, that scope to try to de-risk investment, and it would be determined on a project by project, case by case basis. And I'm sure that if there is a strong climate rationale, if the business case is good, if all the investment criteria check out, the GCF will try to support. And if it is an instance where the GCF actually can respond to that mandate, it will be checked out. And also, I know another innovative area, an area that has been touted out, you know, GCF has been approached by countries to look at the whole debt for adaptation swap. It is very in preliminary stages, so preliminary discussions with ECLAC and with countries. Recently, the fund has been engaging Antigua and Barbuda to see how they could come up with something that fits based on the mandate of the fund. And of course, it's not something that we will be able to possibly engage in right away. We would have to have consideration of our donors and stuff like that. But we are looking at those innovative different aspects and how best we can, within our mandate, are able to support countries.
Thank you, Naranda. And so Amanda, given the scope of the partnership, and not just, you know, the CAP initiative that was designed for 2020 revision process, has there been discussions within the partnership about the subsequent support after the CAP, and how the partnership is gearing up to support members in translating their goals as set out in their NDCs and LTS into concrete action on the ground? You know, granted, the partnership is I would say somewhat new, but I think that it is a very key component of garnering a lot of development partners together to support countries' ambitions. So if you could give us a little insight on some of the plans of the partnership and kind of the next steps, where do we go from here?
Great, thanks, Fran. And the timing of the NDC update process and the LTS actually aligns really nicely with the timing of the partnership itself. So we're in the process of putting together, finalizing, approving our work program for the next 5 years. So this is actually an active discussion that we've been having in what the role of the partnership is in supporting long-term strategies. And so I'm going to maybe try to illustrate the ways in which we work, and I think how that actually already does a lot of what we want to do, and how we can further leverage that. So really, the partnership is supporting countries in a number of ways. So we're helping them to identify what the immediate needs are, and to help to translate those into requests that are actionable. The other side of what we're doing is helping to actually coordinate the partners and the funders to ensure that they're aligning efforts and ensuring that those efforts are complementary and actually responding to what the immediate priorities of the government are. So it's really it's a two-way conversation that's taking place, and the NDC is at the core of this. But that doesn't mean that the LTS isn't a part of that discussion. If anything, it should be a part of that discussion as well. Because the plans that we work on with governments are short-term plans, naturally the NDC is the starting point for building on the targets, ensuring that they're actionable, that the support is there to carry them forward. But that should be really reflected in what it is that the country is trying to do in the longer term. I wanted to give maybe just a couple of country examples, because I didn't touch on any earlier, but I think this helps to also illustrate some of the ways that we already are supporting these efforts. So through the earlier presentations, I think Jan and Kelly gave some really great kind of trends that we're seeing in the links between the LTS and the NDC. So maybe picking up on some of those. The first one that I would highlight is really around broadening the scope of the NDC and mainstreaming it into new sectors. So this is a huge opportunity to ensure that there are links with the long-term strategy, that the NDC targets are grounded in reality, that they're implementable, that they're credible, they're achievable. In Chile, we are working with the government to define the carbon budget for 2020 to 2030, and each subsequent NDC will include respective carbon budgets. So reduced with each iteration until carbon neutrality is reached in 2050. This also includes setting carbon budgets for selected priority sectors, setting the methodology to decide those budgets, cost benefit analysis for the prioritization of investment. So that's something that's already taking place through the partnership. We heard really about the process of aligning the NDC and the LTC in other climate strategies or national plans. So to give you one example here, in Jordan, the World Bank is aligning the mitigation actions from the NDC with national strategies in the major emitting sectors. So really helping to, again, ground it with the different sectors, with the different players to ensure that that this is going to move forward and it's going to move forward in the right direction. And the last example I wanted to give is around the financing side. And so really financing these long-term climate objectives. We heard Jan talk about how it takes 5 years to move a bankable project from concept to implementation. So really limiting our thinking to 5-year NDCs is not sufficient to get the transformational change that we want to see. And so we need to look for opportunities to use the NDC to finance these long-term objectives. In Nigeria, the partnership is in the process of actually deploying a climate finance advisor. And one of the things that's been included in their terms of reference is to assess the current climate finance projects under consideration across the ministries, including what some of the long-term investment priorities might be. And similarly in Chile, UNDP through the partnership is helping to identify public and private financial flows in the energy sector that can inform decision-making that would result in enhanced investment in these priority sectors. So these are some of the kind of concrete examples of support that we're already seeing through the partnership. And I think the short answer to your question is that the plan is to continue with this and to really use the new enhanced NDCs as well as the LTS as the basis to drive that forward.
Thank you, Amanda. As we're coming close to the end of the event, I wanted to give the floor quickly to all of our panelists for any closing remarks or points that you would like to reiterate, especially from those questions that you may have answered in the chat. And so with that, Uname, I'll hand over to you for just a 30-second to 1 minute closing remarks.
Thank you again, Fran. I think one of the point that needs to be made is that the NDC enhancement and the long-term development strategy has to take place within the broader development framework of all the countries. 2030 plan, which was clearly articulated, which is a bipartisan plan, which all the stakeholders buy into, and every single policy and plan that is developed must be aligned to the Vision 2030, which is 99% aligned to the SDGs. So there is gradual alignment that is taking place there, and this plan is implemented right across all the ministries, departments, and agencies. And therefore, if this interlinkage and intertwining, as we want to call it, among the policies and plan, the national buy-in by the stakeholders and the translation of the work that we are doing, I think we are in a good way, and therefore hope that the ambition that we intend to raise will be raised. Thanks.
Thank you, Uname. Kelly?
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks again for inviting me. I think, not only is this year so incredibly critical to make sure that we get onto a different emissions trajectory, but the linking of NDCs and LTS is really a critical vehicle for doing so, just to ensure that the short-term commitments that countries are putting forward are really aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement, and not locking in carbon-intensive trajectories. And I guess I just wanted to offer, WRI's support as well as those are embarking on this journey. We've put together a number of different papers and a bank of expert perspectives looking at these really thorny issues and case studies of how different countries are handling it. I'll put in the chat our website, which has a lot of these different resources. But I think we're all on this journey together and really looking forward to learning from each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. And I feel like that also helped towards answering one of our last questions there. So Naranda, over to you.
Thank you, Fran. Just want to reiterate gratitude for allowing GCF to participate in this panel and to put it out there again that we are ready to support countries in meeting their commitments under the Paris Agreement, whether short-term or long-term. Thank you.
Thank you, Naranda. And finally, Amanda.
Sure. So I think the only thing I would add, and this is really looking forward to COP26 and what we expect to see over the next few months, A lot of the focus right now is on the ambition of country NDCs, and we saw some fantastic news this week out of China in terms of their own ambition. But the thing that I want to highlight is that I don't think ambition is the only part of the story. I think that it's really important that we recognize, and I think this is positive, that countries are doing a lot to make sure that their NDCs are actually implementable. And that includes embedded in their long-term strategy. Through CAP, we're seeing that actually 100% of the countries who are receiving support through CAP are taking significant steps to improve the quality of their NDC. So that ensures making sure that targets are well informed, that they're based on modeling, that they're realistic, that the right costing of targets has taken place, that they're credible, including identifying funding sources, but also including that there are clear pathways to implementation. So I think we're on the right track, and this panel, at least for me, has definitely given me a lot of food for thought and things to think about and flag to countries. And just to say thanks again, Fran, for organizing this.
Thank you, and thank you all for your closing remarks. I think one of my takeaways from all of your interventions is that there is a lot of opportunity ahead of us, and granted there are most certainly challenges, there are opportunities, and there are certainly resources available for at least all developing countries to make that transformation. So I'd also like to thank the USG for taking her time to provide a message for our event. I'd like to thank our presenter, Jan, for providing some insight on that and setting the scene for today. And of course, our panelists. I know this week has been extremely hectic for a variety of reasons, and this year, more than most, I know that all of you are most certainly in high demand. Thank you very much. And then finally, to our participants, thank you so much for staying with us for the entire event, and also for your active engagement and questions sent prior to the event and those that were sent during the last hour and a half to 2 hours. We have some great challenges ahead of us in planning towards our long-term low emission development strategies, not just this year, next year, but as the cycle goes on. But in doing so, as I said, we also have some great opportunities ahead of us. We look forward to working with you all and the international community at a variety of different levels to tackle this great challenge that we do have. And so if anybody has any follow-up questions, please do not hesitate to contact us. Our contact information is on the event details and of course on our website. The recording of the event will be posted on our website and accessible to all, including the presentations that the panelists provided. So you can take a look at that after the event. And so thank you all again so very much. And with that, I'll close and say until next time, stay safe and hopefully see you very soon in person.